Okay, so let's go back to our brain simulator. Let's see if it's still around here anywhere. So we have an attachment center right here. Yes, he brought me an iced coffee. I'm particularly attached to him. He's the one who feeds me and brings me to drink. Well, here's an interesting thing. Total trivia, but we attach to the one who feeds us, but men in particular attach to whoever brings them something to drink. So the male attachment center is actually strongly tied to liquids. Very strongly tied to liquids. As a matter of fact, you can tell which men have raised children because their liquid processing system changes as a result of attachment. And if you look at how men attach, they're always attaching around drinking some liquid or another. And they view the people who keep their liquid level up as the ones that sustain their life. I mean, that's how the brain is wired. You go out, you're running around, your people will make sure you have something to drink, whether you're hunting or whatever else. You might not feed until you get way back to whatever it is. But the people that keep you alive are the ones that make sure you have some drink. And so you will bond to whoever brings you something to drink. So this is very central to the mechanism in men. Now the problem is we can't scan you to find out whether you have raised a child or not. We actually have to take a few slides out of your brain. So we have to take your brain out and make slides, stain it. But from that perspective, I'll pass on that. Which you'll pass. It's actually possible to tell whether men have raised children, and the chemical behind that is the vasopressin. So if some of you are familiar with it, the vasopressin system is changed dramatically by attachment. Now women tend to, excuse me, women's attachment tends to form around oxytocin, which is actually vasopressin, oxytocin are very related systems within the brain. And oxytocin is the thing that starts labor. It's also a thing that triggers the milk letdown reflex. So when women have oxytocin, among other things, you provide liquid for your babies. And so wouldn't be too surprised that for men who don't have that response, receiving liquids is tied to vasopressin system and function. So all of this, there's some pretty central kind of biology related around it. But the interesting point, and my wife always wants me to make this point to people, and that is that when women talk to each other, it creates oxytocin. So women bond with each other by processing experiences over and over. The more time they process it, the more oxytocin it generates. So the idea of just talking about stuff is bonding producing for women. For men, running a processing thing over creates cortisol, the stress hormone. So the more times we have to talk about this, the more stressed I become. And in fact, there's one theory that the difference in lifespan between men and women is determined by this processing time. As the women are talking things through, they're decreasing their husband's lifespan while increasing their own. It's not malicious, but it happens reliably because the systems are just designed differently. And so what used to happen is I'd go home and I'd process something. My wife, I have to talk about my day. And she'd talk about her day, and I'd think to myself, for the sake of our relationship, I must endure this thing, and we'll talk about her day. And then she'd talk about it, and I thought, that I used my last bit of, life for this. Then she'd pick up the phone and tell her sister exactly the same thing we just had gone over. And I went, why did I kill myself? Or talk through the day. Now she's going to tell her sister, and she could pick it up and then talk to her mother about the same thing again. It was like, this is driving me wild. And if I didn't want to, it would drive her wild, right? But we actually determined that women need women friends. And so what actually happens, and now we just smile at each other, and I say, you need to call your sister. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I said, you need to talk about this again, don't you? Yes, that's right. And so we have looked for ways. She's now more likely to bring me a drink, right? Well, non-alcoholic, but she'll give me some liquid, and I go like, I think you're a source of life for me right there. Thank you for that. And then she'll talk to her sister about things. So we're actually using these little bits of detail to improve the attachment between us, and we can smile about it and talk about our differences. But going back to the attachment, I was about to say, you brought me a drink, an iced coffee for the afternoon, so my attachment center is looking at him as the source of life, and I'm sorry the rest of you just kind of lower down in the scale. So, yeah. So, now we're good, yes?
What was the connection between telling about the man's bonding with the child or the attachment? I didn't get that. You said you can tell
if men have raised a child, it produces permanent changes in their liquid processing system.
And what does that mean? I mean, like, just
what? It just means that system has become much more tied to regulating their behavior because they've built a bond. It's just a side effect of building a bond, and it's tied to their vasopressin system, whereas with women, when they build a bond, you get your oxytocin system going up. Okay. So it's very different. Oxytocin system is your cuddly hormone. It's also the hormone associated with monogamy. So if we want to talk about voles, the little creatures, right? Right? There's two different kinds of voles. Well, there's more than two different kinds, but one vole has oxytocin systems running and the other one doesn't. The oxytocin voles are monogamous. The non-oxytocin voles are polygamous, or actually opportunist. They will just any vole will do. Right. Yeah, I don't want to be a non-oxytocin vole right there, you see. So they've actually been studied very carefully, trying to figure out what's behind monogamy. But the point is, in addition, animals can smell oxytocin. So if you're creating bonding, and men and women both create oxytocin. Men like cuddly, women like cuddly. It's just that women bond around cuddly a lot more, and men bond around, give me something to drink, and then we'll cuddle, as opposed to the other way around, right? So we're getting back to this brain. I'm wandering all over the woods again, aren't I? So here's the brain. It says, something's important to me. This is personally relevant. You go over here at level 2 and you have 3 opinions again, which are? Good, bad, and scary. If you have one of those opinions and you're not PTSD, it goes to level 3 and you decide what?
Pass it on. Yeah, pass it on. How it feels.
Yeah. How it feels is what you're looking at, but the real important function that happens at level 3 is can this be shared with other people? And this is what we mean by mutual mind. If I'm feeling this, will someone other understand and want to share my experience with me? That's mutual mind. And if I'm very good at that, what would Siegel call that? Mindsight, exactly right. Or when this system is on and running, humming very nicely, the general condition of the brain is called? Okay, synchronization, yes. But the popular term nowadays is mindfulness. I'm being mindful. Mindful means level 3 is up and humming, and it is interacting with everything right now. And because of that, At level 4, we're updating everything in real time. I'm not living in the past. I'm not living in reaction to other things. I'm interacting with people. I'm acting like myself, and my people, what would my people do? So my group identity is now governing how I live life in the world. I'm acting like me and my people in all contexts because we have that information, and because you say we can. If I don't happen to know how to act like myself and my people, it's open for conversation. My people are the kind of people who, if I don't know how to act like myself, we would talk about it, right? Of course, to talk about it, we have to put the information over here. So you say, you know, we're here and we're present and we're interacting with the world and you see what's in front of us, but we don't actually know how it is, how we're supposed to act like ourselves. As our procedural department, what procedure should we follow in order to learn how to act like ourselves? This is where procedural memory and all the left hemisphere becomes very popular, you see, because now we've slowed it down to conscious rate, and we're saying we're drawing a blank up here. We know we're connected with people, but when you draw a blank about who you are, what do you do? How do we go about doing that? How do you word it? How do you understand it? How do you select out of all the options of people in the world who's going to go there? All of that sorting it out in procedure is what you want to have the left hemisphere do for you. All right? And if you've got good procedures, then this is going to work very, very well. But what ends up happening is I would call those repair procedures. So I remember one time sitting with one lady. She was borderline, and during that time there was a saying going on around therapists. It said therapists love their dissociators and they hate their borderlines, which is basically true. When your borderline came in, your stomach said, "Oh God, not that again." And when your poor dissociator came in, the lovely little personalities that just needed you and loved you and wanted to talk to you about their traumas. Oh, you just wish they could sit on your lap and talk to you about it all day long. Not telling stories out of school, but this is, you know, if you got behind the door and you looked at what was going on in the therapist, this was the basic response you had. Now, the interesting thing is a borderline is basically someone who does not know how to stay in relationship in any of the big 6 emotions. So their repair procedure is, you're supposed to help me. According to the rules, you're the therapist, right? So I'm going to insist that you be the therapist, and the therapist is supposed to be helpful with whatever I bring in. So how I'm going to do this is I'm going to make sure you feel every bit as rotten as I do right now, and then you show me how you're going to deal with it. Give me an example. And so borderlines are extraordinarily good at making you feel absolutely as rotten as they are. And when you feel that way, now you're going to show me how to be a joyful Christian individual who's very therapeutic and has the kind of life you have. Now the problem being that if you're the average therapist, by the way, how many therapists does it usually take, not to change a light bulb, this is not a joke, to help somebody overcome borderline? There's actual statistic. Dozens? No, not that high. 7. And guess what? If you break it down, what do you notice with each of the therapists? That 6 of them are good with one of those 6 emotions.
Oh, wow.
They can handle the anger stuff here. Come on in, or they can handle the sad. If you want to come in and be sad, I'll show you how to be relational with sad. But if you are going to stand up one more time and pee on my couch because you're mad, and I got someone referred to me because that's what they did. They would get mad and they'd pee on your couch. If you're going to do that, you're going to have to be referred, because we cannot have you peeing on our couch in here. You know what I paid for that leather couch. You know that that's the last peeing on my couch you're going to do. We are no longer relational if you're going to be that way about it, right? That also would have elements of what other feelings? Shame, disgust, yeah, especially disgust. So if I don't do disgust real well, then peeing on the couch, that's it. We have boundaries. Boundaries, by the way, are typically how therapists justify being borderline in their own behavior. Yeah, and that sounds like a joke, but I actually mean it totally. Healthy boundaries are the limits of what I can do and still be myself. But borderline boundaries are the restrictions I put on you so that you must stay within these limitations. And you real quickly you realize which kind of boundaries we're talking about. Are you talking about restricting me, or are you talking about I couldn't do that and be myself? And you'll have a very different internal response to one or the other. If someone says, well, you know, I know how to do that, but I couldn't do that to you and still be myself, you feel like you're being cared for. And the other way, you feel like you're being controlled, regulated, and forced into something. And you tend to resent whatever it is. But so you have borderlines. They typically sequentially go through 6 therapists who can deal with one of those feelings. They get referred to another one who can deal with, you're going to do this one. And then the last therapist is one that sort of teaches them about life and that sort of thing. But what is their repair strategy? If something goes wrong, the way to fix it is to make you feel as bad as I do. Right? So, this lady was yelling at me. She called me a number of names I had never been called before, and I was quite sure that everybody in the entire suite could hear what was being said in my office, because there's no doubt that we weren't that well insulated against sound. And as she sat over there yelling at me, and I'm sitting in my chair thinking, am I allowed to leave? She suddenly stopped, and level 5 over here said to me, don't you realize that when I yell at this way, I want you to come over here and comfort me? And I shook my head. I said, no, never crossed my mind at all that was an invitation to get close. This is my repair strategy. This is what I noticed that my mom did when something was wrong in our family and she wanted to fix it. This is how she tried to get us to be a family together. She would yell all these kind of things to me. This is my strategy over here. So if I want to make things better, this is how we do it. And as I was shaking my head like that, a smile passed her face, which I think may have been the first smile I saw in therapy with her at all. And she said, doesn't work very well, does it? And I may have had my first smile in return to her when she said that, because I was quite sure she was right. No, this is not the repair strategy we want. So, all of that lecture to say now, when you've passed the problem over here, you're going to look at the repair strategies you know, and a lot of the repair strategies are things like, well, if I cut myself, if I drink till where I don't remember, if I, you know, whatever it is, these are the ways that you fix what are often called therapeutic ruptures, right? You're familiar with that from the psychoanalytic object relations people. They talk about ruptures. It's the times that your relationships break down. We're not glad to be together. There is no joy. There's at least one of the 6 negative feelings, and often up to 6 of them at the same time. Now, how do we fix this? And if you don't, your brain doesn't know how to do it. That is, when someone's really angry at you, your brain doesn't go, wow, we really need to fix our relationship, and I know just how to do it. So if you had to get mad at anybody, I'm glad it's me, because I'm exactly the kind of help you need right now. If you have that response inside, you move towards the person and go like, wow, you're really in trouble, aren't you? Right? If you saw someone choking and you know Heimlich, you don't go like, how dare you choke in my office? I've got boundaries. Choking's not allowed in here. You're going to choke in here. You're going to have to go find a different therapist. You go and you Heimlich them, right? not because you particularly enjoy it, but because that's what you need right now. And so we have somebody who's choking, they're using all the wrong repair strategies, and you go, wow, you are in need of some better strategies than that, because when I feel that, and I feel it as strongly as you do, I realize that how you're going about fixing this, someone taught you exactly the wrong way to go about it, which is why almost everybody who has borderline is a second generation, at least, trauma victim. So what you might have is third and fourth and fifth generation trauma victims. So it might be more than that, but you almost never get borderline without at least 2 generations of trauma back to back. So now you've not only got the trauma, but you've got a wrong repair strategy with it. And if you've got the emotions from trauma and a completely non-workable repair strategy, you now have produced borderline. Now, just to make that one step farther, if you can handle all of the emotions except shame, then you have what we call narcissism. Narcissism is someone who becomes borderline when they hit shame, but they do the other emotions all right. So if the only one that really sets you into borderline behavior is shame, we call that narcissism. Now you can't shame me, we can't produce an emotional interaction where you're not glad to be with me. At all times you must act like I'm good, and it's not so much good, but you always have to act like you're glad to be with me, because if not, my reaction is going to trigger some repair strategies that are going to make sure that you feel worse than I feel. So this repair strategy is, if anyone makes me feel shame, I am going to be sure that they end up with the problem, not me. And if anyone's going to hurt around me, it's going to be you that's going to hurt and not me. Now that repair strategy, every time I implement it, what's that going to do to my relational network? It's going to get smaller, yeah, and it's going to continue to contain only those who will agree with me, that will work together to avoid shame. Because that's, we have no bridge. So the best I can do to be part of this network, which has all these other benefits, but is to avoid shame within that network. Once you have a bridge that says, you know what, we can feel shame and use that to improve our relationship, suddenly I don't even need your repair strategy. I can bypass it. Now, if you have somebody who has an entire social network that supports their narcissistic strategy, what will be able to happen is that since they will turn predator on you and their entire group will support them, they will have no reason whatsoever to stop being narcissists, because they always have support and they always have hostages. And in fact, if you won't do it, I'm going to hurt him or her. There's always a hostage, and the support network will always say, well, we can't have them be hurt. So we'll have to back the repair strategy. This is how you fix things, is by making sure that the narcissist doesn't go off, right? Can't upset your mother. This is another version of that. The whole group happens. So what inevitably happens why you can't get narcissists to change is because the group will end up supporting the narcissist repair strategy, which is you better avoid getting them upset, right? And while that's in place, no one player can avoid being eaten alive when they're the target. And so it's impossible for any one player, including a therapist one-on-one, to intervene in this strategy, because you actually have to change the group's strategy, not the individual strategy. Our group has to deal with this problem differently. We have to say, around here, our people just don't do that. We don't eat people. We don't jump on people. Our people do not. What we actually do is we love our enemies. So that person looks like an enemy to you. They're doing these things. This is exactly when our people act loving. And what you just did to totally humiliate them, N'est pas possible. We cannot do that. It's not us. Aquí no se hace. Whatever language you've got for your people, we don't do that around here. That's just not the kind of people we are. So we're going to have to go back, and you know what? We're going to have Jesus' presence here, because he's going to have to talk to you about who he meant you to be. Oh, you don't want to admit to him that you did anything wrong? Because did you do anything wrong? No, not up here. So now we're back to our diagram. During post-traumatic stress, the part of the brain that's most disconnected, most desynchronized, is the left prefrontal cortex. And now, in other words, the people who explain things are the people who are most out of touch after PTSD. And if your brain is in trauma mode or shutdown mode, and trauma mode is exactly the same always, it's blocked at level 3, right? Level 2 is raising Cain. Level 3 is off. So, however you get to this, whether it happened to be, we could talk about type A and type B trauma within the model. Did I get here because I didn't build enough joy, which would be the absence of necessary good things, so my brain is just weak when it hits this moment? Or did I get here because something bad happened that just overloaded me? It doesn't matter really to the function. My brain is shut down either way. So the end result is I'm now acting like a PTSD brain during this moment in time. Can I go back on the PTSD checklist and say, here's something bad enough to have caused PTSD in 90% of the human population? And is that being triggered in your mind and running through, and you'll go, no. I don't see anything on here that's bad enough to upset 90% of the world's population, and it's not flashing back, it's not running through your mind. So according to the checklist, you don't have it. But according to the way your brain is running, it's running like somebody in a post-traumatic stress would. And the last people to know anything about it, up here, the most disconnected part, is the part that explains what's going on and gives you the procedure to make it better. So, Paul Simon had this one song. He said, well, when something goes wrong, I'm the first to admit it and the last one to know. Yeah. Some of you may be old enough to remember that song. And that's, I think, how I would describe this section of the brain right here. If they saw it, they'd be the first to admit it, but they're the last one to know it. So from their perspective, now whatever's going wrong is caused by whatever's in front of me. Having no other information, they instantly know that within a third of a second. And now whatever strategy you have for solving this problem is going to be implemented. And you probably learned that from people with really bad procedures, right? Because no one that you knew could handle this feeling, this kind of experience, at least not in a way that my people would like. They're usually a way that my people would work like crazy to avoid. But now that's going to be the way that you fix. I'm going to make sure that all of you get so upset that you're never going to do this one again. And that should fix it. Now I've shared my internal state with you, and you're going to remember that. And if you need a booster shot from time to time to remember just how bad you could feel if you cross this boundary again, I will. It's how many times do I have to yell at you? Why do you only do what I want you to do and I have to raise my voice? Why do I have to be this unpleasant with you? You know, have you ever heard that happening in Kmart or Target or grocery store or something like that? Over and over, it's like I'm going to have to give you another dose of how unpleasant this feels so that you can learn to avoid this, and that's how I'll repair a relationship. The only problem is that that booster shot inevitably drifts away because our brain is trying not to feel that any longer than we possibly have to. So we don't keep it around for motivation. We get rid of it any way we can and block it any way we can, think about it as little as we can, and all of a sudden a lot of really strange human behavior starts to make sense, doesn't it? This is how we're trying to make this thing run. It's not a joy-based system. It's all of us agreeing what we're afraid of, and then we work together to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, how does that fit like theology? Someone mentioned hellfire and brimstone. I won't say who Judy was, but having grown up with that kind of theology, what do we all do together? We work to make sure we don't make God mad, right? We don't do anything that's going to upset him. And if we can keep from upsetting him, then we should all act like Christians. Right? It's using this same system which we've now duplicated and the same kind of set of repairs. If I can just keep from doing all of the following things, then God wouldn't be upset with me. And if we need to get somebody else to become better Christians, what do? We give them a dose of all of how upset God's going to be, right? Sinners in the hands of an angry God. As soon as you forget how mad God's going to be at this. And so much of Christian theology is built around some system like that. So if God's going to be that mad, then you're going to have to talk to Jesus to try to calm God down, because maybe he'll be on your side. But if Jesus is too mad at you too, then you're going to have to talk to his mother, because his mother, she can calm down Dad sometimes when he's upset. And so maybe he'll be on your side. And if not that, at least why don't you go to the person, Peter always used to get in that kind of trouble, and so he would understand you and he could relate to you. At least you'd be on the par with him, and he could talk to Jesus' mother, and then she could talk to Jesus, and then she could calm down God, and we could work something out here. And so the theology gets worked out this way, trying to find somebody who would understand and share the feeling with us, so that at least some part of God's kingdom could be present with us when we feel this badly, and be a resource to us. And then all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense how you get the theologies that grow up around that. And we're sort of shortcutting all of that by saying, you know what, Jesus is so bonded to you that no matter what you're feeling right now, it actually won't disconnect him from you. So, but what it will do, it'll effectively if you hit anything that shuts down level 3, right, you will no longer be aware he's with you. So all of what we're talking about is how do we increase people's ability to stay aware that Jesus is with them, right? And now we're talking again, we're back to the basic strategies. And that is, we can do that by building a better set of memories around God being with us. Starting with the easiest times. Let's think of the time in your life that you felt most connected with God. What were your best experiences with him? It's really interesting to me, since I'm a bit of an experimenter, I run around the world and I'm willing to ask anybody, atheist, theist, other religion, pagan, whatever it is, to remember a time. I don't even ask them if they believe it, because believing is over here, the experience is over here. It says, remember a time when you knew that God was with you. And I have really yet to get anybody other than career Christians who couldn't remember it. Yeah, career Christians have so many unpleasant things connected with God and his presence that what ends up happening when you think of God, all your memories related to the topic of God load on in. So if you've got all these unpleasant things all the time that said God's trying to teach you patience, God's trying to do this, God's trying to reveal whatever's, everything that's in that file loads into level 2. And is God good? Or is God bad and scary? I mean, we wouldn't be caught dead saying that God's bad, right? But does he feel bad to us? Well, one of us is bad, so maybe I'm the one that's bad, but when I think about God, I always feel like the one that's bad. So, again, I use myself as an illustration because I'm very portable. So, I was 5 years old. The first time I went out on Good Friday, and we went to the Good Friday service where they were going to preach on the 7 last words of Jesus. Are you familiar with that? Been down there? Okay. So, given that I grew up in Colombia, which was basically the same as Rwanda, except that we only killed off 250,000 people instead of 1 million in the first 10 years of my life. But the difference when you're 10 years old between 250,000 and 1 million just doesn't cross your mind, because you really only have to know 1 or 2 or, so while it's statistically significant, relationally it's not significant. But everybody around me has been and is going through this. So the idea of the 7 last words of Jesus start out with the first preacher going to explain to the audience in the terms that is graphic enough for them to understand just how hideous the crucifixion was. So he goes at it for 20 minutes trying to describe how bad the crucifixion was. Ends up with the words of Jesus, and then he points to the audience and said, "And you did this to him." Then the next guy gets up, and he goes at it for 20 minutes trying to outdo the first. And he ends by saying, "And you are the one that did this to him." And this goes on for 7 people. Now, I'm 5 years old, and I'm sitting in the front, and I know that I've been told that I went to visit my grandmother, but I don't remember being there. There's pictures of it. So I know I've been there, but I don't remember it. So the fact that I was being told I did this, but I don't remember it, doesn't mean I didn't do it. And up until then, when I'd got to church that day, I thought I loved Jesus. So, level 1, does this seem personally relevant to me? Level 2, do I have an opinion about what I'm hearing? This is going to be, this is bad and scary. Yeah, I had no idea what I had done. Now I'm finding out. Level 3, is this shareable? All right, so level 4, no, nothing here? Nothing here. Level 5, you happen to have a repair strategy for being in church? Listening to sermons? Not exactly anything coherent over there. As you break it down, over there, do you know how are we going to talk about how bad church was? I don't think we're going to talk about how bad church was. No. Am I going to go around and talk to everybody about how bad I obviously am? No? Bad enough that probably people heard at church what I had done? Is anyone going to really want to be with me now? They were obviously all very upset about what I had done. See how that processes through the brain? Next time that someone says, let's go to Good Friday service, and what am I going to have a reaction about that? All right. So you see how the brain has gone ahead and processed this entire experience incorrectly. Now, when I go to think about God and Jesus and what he did for me on the cross, what's going to load into my brain in terms of my relationship to God at this point? Bad, scary, loving and special? No loving and special, right? Well, I want to think about what Jesus has done for me. Will I want to talk to him about when I'm feeling upset? Every time you mention Jesus and what he did for me, what's going to be my internal reaction? Fear, shame. I don't want to think about this. I just feel rotten. Don't talk to me about Jesus. I was feeling bad enough till you brought him up, right? So the chances that I'm going to look at him as a resource are down to
0.
not if I can avoid it, right? Now, that's one experience only. That's one afternoon, a couple hours. Now, you accumulate that for a lifespan, and what's your brain going to do when you say to somebody, oh, let's talk to God about it. Let's invite Jesus in. Let's, whatever it is. That is why career Christians who have a stack of such things, when you ask them, about God's, remember a time when God was glad to be with you, all of that stuff loads in. God, oh, yeah. What did God do for you? Yeah, no, I don't want to think about that. I have all bad feelings. Yes?
Why do you, I think the way you're explaining it, my experience has been that toxic faith is one of the hardest things to overcome in helping somebody. Do you find that to be true?
So the question is whether toxic faith is the hardest thing to overcome.
It's one of the hardest things. I find it very good. I find several people in my congregation with it, and it's very difficult to get them to address it or be honest about it. There's so many complicated feelings. Mom and dad raised me this way. They're good people, but look what happened to me, this authoritarian, whatever, So,
yeah, so I think you're calling it toxic faith. I'm breaking it down to components.
Okay.
So toxic faith is going to have a whole lot of memories that are mixed, have combined God with something really unpleasant, some unpleasant feeling.
Right.
It's going to have a whole cocktail of things that we don't talk about. It's going to have a whole set of ways that my people act about things that happen that upset us that are going to be counterproductive, and it's going to have a whole set of repair strategies which are in the area of saying, look this way and don't let them see this. So all your repair strategies actually enforce the whole pattern. And if you're upset enough, you have now created exactly the kind of wound that attracts demonic intelligence to help you explain what's going on and what's happening here. And that it's like, will a festering wound attract flies? I don't care whether or not they're in you or out you or around you, they'll be around. And they will be very helpful in explaining how this works and what so that's a nasty mess. That's a full-on infection right there that is extremely, there's no little simple just do this and the whole thing will unravel. Because you spend a whole lifetime of actually intelligently trying to create this. You weren't the intelligence behind it, but some other intelligence was behind making sure that every time we have a chance to poke this wound and get it infected farther, I'm going to do that. And if you don't have any people who are your resources to help you clean and disinfect it every time that happens, you just are going to increase it'll spiral down. So that more or less where I'm going with the whole thing. So going back to asking people who don't have that, there's no associations with God. I don't believe he exists. You've got a much cleaner slate to go in. And then when something pops into your head that goes like, oh, I hadn't thought about that, but now the thought's coming to me. I did feel like there was something else in the universe besides me, and it was looking out for me. It, him, her, whatever it was. And you just watch that popping into their heads. And the fact is, God has made his presence known to everybody on earth. They may or may not recognize it as God, but when you give them an opportunity to think about it, and that's why I just asked him, why don't you remember a time when you experienced God's presence with you. Something pops into their heads, unless they run into this boatload of toxic stuff, and they look at you with this like, well, yeah, I'm thinking of something. Look, it gives you a chance to invite God's presence in to have some other experience with them. Let's go with that. So the way I test whether it's God's presence or not is that if it is God's presence, whatever has come into their mind will have a sense of being true, and it'll make sense of what's going on in their life. So being true doesn't, when Jesus said to the woman at the well, you've spoken the truth. You don't have a husband. The man you're with now is not your husband. You've had however many, was it? 7, 5, 7, 12, 5? I forgot the number. She thought, that's true. That all makes sense. In fact, that whole history was why she was out there at the well by herself, no doubt, right? But it fit together in such a way that you felt like, I think this person has understood and known who I am. This is the sign that you look at. That's what I call peaceful in the sense of shalom. Hey, that all fits together. This unusual person in front of me knows all of these sorts of things. This all fits together in a picture that makes me think maybe I've run into a prophet, or maybe he's the one he says he is. It's sort of making sense to me. Now that you can notice from her how she runs back to the city and tells her, come meet someone who told me everything I've ever done. Could he be Messiah? Her left hemisphere is still running the numbers. But her right hemisphere has got no questions. I know and understand something. I can't process it over here yet. I haven't gotten, this is not, it's not lining up. But I know what I know, and I'm trying to figure out how that can be. And so this sense that you have when God lets you know something, you know that you know something. And when it's not God, I'm so far 100% reliable, it doesn't produce peace. I have yet to see anything but God, and I've met all kinds of other spiritual forces and stuff like that, have all kinds of impact. Not one of them can produce that kind of peace. And I don't know, it's because if they don't know how, or it's flat out because God won't let them. But whatever it is, he doesn't let the rest of the spirit world produce the kind of peace he does. And so regardless of where I am and who I'm dealing with and how little or much theology to have this kind of perfect peace land on you has only come from one source. So I am now at the point where I always check for it, but I'm not really particularly worried about getting any kind of fake, real deep peace, because I've never seen it happen with anybody, any place. The closest we get again is going back to the career Christians who might from time to time have a fake Jesus in their mind who helps them feel a little better than they did. But if you check with them the next day, the peace is gone. So with career Christians again, I do the 3 checks. I'll check now, I'll check tomorrow or the next day, and then I'll check again another time in a week or two, see if it's still there. Because we of all people have the most mistaken ideas about what Jesus is like. And so it's much harder for us to tell what's our imagination from what isn't. But when we hit the real thing, it's got this enduring peace. It's still as peaceful as it was before. It doesn't mean that everything in my brain is peaceful. It just means that every time I get back to this spot, it's still peaceful. That's still totally true. I don't know where this other stuff fits in, but that again becomes our test. So you all got a little booklet called Passing the Peace. And basically what we're looking at there is the 3 ways that we have learned to teach the Emanuel process. and the Emanuel process you now are beginning to become very, very familiar with. You go back to any appreciation memory, thankfulness, appreciation memory, and now you would know that if it's really a good thing, all good things come from God. So whether or not I can see God behind it, I'm now very close to being connected to one of his moments in my life. Right? Even if I'm just appreciating good iced coffee. This is courtesy of Juan Valdez, who's a good friend of mine. Been up to his farm. He's totally fictional, but I have been to lots of coffee farms in Colombia. But you see what I mean is behind that is God, not very, very far back. Because in his good gifts to us, we're very, very close to him. And in many of them, which we call our 5-bar moments, we actually are aware that God's with us. So, and when we do, we have that peaceful sense of his presence, right? Now what we want to do as people is help others experience the peaceful presence of God. And if you are there and God's peaceful presence is in you, you realize you now have levels 1, 2, 3, 4 up and running smoothly. And we've got level 5 over here ready to observe and comment on it, because you'll be getting real information. Now anything God has to say to us, we'll have a chance to process all the way through. And if it's God and it synchronizes everything, it'll actually build stability within that system. And every time you run a stable process through the brain, it learns better how to stay stable. So the more times you run this stable process, the more white matter you lay down, the more you say, this is how I process reality. I always process reality with God's presence in it. Because God's presence is always there. You know how very often it drops out. So, okay, let's go back and we'll try to process God's presence with the times I forgot to look at him today. Now, how many times today was I not aware? These are not high trauma, are they? We're just learning the habit of processing reality so that it's more complete. Because if my brain looks back at it and goes, I don't remember God being there, how complete was my processing? It missed out at least one important element, right? Let's go back. We're not changing memories. We're making sure that they're completed. So we're not talking about creating memories that weren't there, because God always was there. It was what we're doing is expanding your awareness so that in the awareness of everything else that happened, you're also aware of God's presence and what he wanted you to know about it. So if you do that, is there any area of life that is off limits? All right. So my friend Jim DeGollier, who's now with the Lord, took this down to Ecuador, to Guayaquil, one of the poorest cities in Ecuador. And he said, I'm going to teach this to the people down there. Now, he didn't go to teach it to them as a counseling method. He went down to teach them as a way of life method. This is how we guide our life. The way we guide our life is we make sure we're always aware of what God is doing. And then if he wants you to know something or see something, then you do what he does, because that's obedience that goes with being guidance, but that's all we do. So he taught it to the youth department. So now all I want you to do is be thankful, be aware of God's presence, and then we'll just move with that, and we'll learn that whatever we're doing, we're going to stay grateful that God's presence is with us. He says a lot of things can happen to you that you won't be grateful for. But there's nothing so bad in life that you wouldn't be grateful that God was there with you, is there? No, I would always be grateful. The worse it gets, in fact, the more grateful I am that God's here with me, right? So now I can be thankful in all things. Not for all things, right? In all things I'm thankful that even here, God is with me. Because this is the kind of day and the kind of place and the kind of moment, the kind of upset that it really sure is good to have God with me. And furthermore, we'll remember that any one of us could at any moment forget. So what we do as a community, our group identity, is every time we notice that someone else has forgotten that God is with us, we will help them find God again, not by rebuking them, but by going back to the last time they remember God being with them and reconnecting. Or if not the last time, one of the best times. And so we'll just practice that with each other. And you know, the interesting thing began to happen is the youth group got very excited about this, and they began listening to God. And when they would, God would say, well, here I am. Well, what do you want us to do? Well, why don't you pray for that person who's sick? And oddly enough, when God said, I want you to pray for that person who's sick, what seemed to inevitably happen? Yeah, they were healed. God said, well, you know, here's a person that's upset. I want you to pray for them. What do you suppose happened? They experienced God's presence, and it brought peace. Now, they had no idea that they were doing inner healing. They had no idea that they were doing physical healing. They didn't think of any of these things. Every once in a while, they would say, well, what did God want you to know? Well, He wants you to know that there's a demon bothering that person. Well, what should we do with that? Well, tell it to leave. What if it doesn't want to go? Well, you tell them, I said it should go. All right, fine, then, you know what? My master said you should go. What did it do? It went, yeah, it's like, wow, can you believe that? So they're running around looking at what happens when God's presence is there. And then he taught them to talk about the difference. What was it like before you experienced God's presence? And what happened? What changed when you did experience God's presence? So I would like to talk a little bit about that in Sri Lanka, but I'm not going to do it quite yet because I want to do other things. So if I start to forget about God's presence and what happened in Sri Lanka, you know, someone, you know, bring me back to it, okay? But we're going back to this. The next thing that they did when they're feeling this peaceful sense of God's presence, they would ask somebody, does that presence, does that peace like being with you? And what they discovered, and what I would like to say to you, is that peace was a presence, not a feeling. And once your mind has gone around that corner, that this peace is a presence and not a feeling, we're no longer trying to produce good feelings in ourselves. We're learning to live in the presence of the one that brings us peace. And we want to introduce other people to that presence. And what I find over and over again is that when you ask someone the question, does that presence like being with you, that the presence introduces himself. I don't tell them who the presence is. The presence tells them who they are. And so I've had an entire room full of Muslims experience the presence. The presence told them who he was. They were thankful for the peace, but they were even more excited about the presence. And, well, there is a side effect to that. Same thing that happened with the Hindus. They all decided to follow this one. So unfortunately, I didn't have a room of Muslims anymore, or a room of Hindus, because they liked the effect of this presence, and they wanted to follow the one that had brought them peace. And it's been fairly consistent across the world. If you will experience the presence, it's even interesting for people who are heavily demonized, saying to them, you know, like, these demons saying they protect me, and if I get rid of them, I'll be in danger and all kinds of bad things. It's all fear mapped, right? All these awful things are going to happen if you chase me out of here. So I will say to them, you know what, you can have every one of those spirits that you want to have, but would you like to just set them aside temporarily and experience this presence? And then if you want to go back to them, you can have them all. And so, you guys stand aside, we're going to experience this presence, talk with him, ask him what you're afraid of, deal with him. Okay, now comes the time, you can have them all back. You want them back? I haven't had anybody yet who really wanted to have them all back. I had a few that have decided I want a few days. So can you kind of hold on to them over there for a few days while I think this over? And, but even then, after a few days of the presence, they said, you know what, I don't want it back. He told me they've been lying to me, and here's what they've been doing. I didn't explain it to him. I mean, I knew they'd been lying to him, right? Don't we all? Right? But I didn't tell him. This presence is an active presence. It's not just a belief. And so part of what I'm trying to encourage all of us is if we're a community that helps others encounter this presence and form a relationship with it, I'm saying it, right? I don't think it's it, but I'm just using that vocabulary. Now we're actually building a new kind of people. And we're developing a new group identity because we are the people who express this presence in the world. And that's our lead characteristic. And actually, we're learning to do it so well that we can no longer tell for sure if it's us or him. And he actually doesn't care and likes it better that way, and actually so do we. Yeah. Yeah, but where we're most sure that it's him is when we're doing this with our enemies. All those people that are clogging our system, so our brain is loading in all this sort of stuff. But when we go back to his presence, we realize, no, that's not the peaceful part. See, when we're doing that, we realize that it actually is him making a new kind of people out of us. And by the way, people with trauma have a nice long list of enemies. So it is not incompatible with dealing with trauma. And the actual problem is that most of these people do way down at the level of their attachment center love their enemies. They're actually quite attached to their abusers. But you can't process that around without the presence and the kind of joy that he builds, so that you realize, the reason I've had so much pain in my life is because I was actually born the kind of person that would love somebody even if they abused me. I'm so built for attachment that I couldn't even not attach when you were doing that to me. That's so deeply wired into my being. And the people around me are very supportive of that because they know how much it would hurt to love somebody that was intent on hurting us, right? We would not want such a person to be alone, regardless of how upset they were. We'd want to share that upset with them, wouldn't we? And we want to say, oh yeah, I'd be that upset too, because I know you're just the kind of person that would be so upset that there wouldn't even be words for how much it would bother you to love the person that was hurting you that way. And all of a sudden, an awful lot of why it hurts so bad is starting to make sense. You've become a friend of their heart. And we need people who can do that for us, or we won't learn this as we're going along. But at all levels of life, we're looking for people who can be friends of our heart. So, within the life model structure, we call this understanding your main pain. If you look back at your life, the things that matter to you the most are going to be the source of the main pain in your life. Your deepest characteristic will always be tied to painful experiences, because every time what matters to you most gets violated, it's going to hurt like crazy. And Satan's strategy is, if I can make what matters to you most hurt so bad that you won't try that ever again, I have neutralized who God meant you to be in the world. Straight up, not very brilliant, but extremely effective strategy. Right? So maybe that's what we're actually trying to do when we call it counseling. We're helping people to discover what they were really meant to do and why the things that hurt us the most are so tied to the things that matter to us the most. And why it is that until we encounter God and God's people in that moment, that we actually don't become free to be who we are. Did I take that corner too fast? Yeah. So what we're trying to work on then is this sense of helping other people experience God's presence and say we're the kind of people that do that. And so in that little booklet, 3 simple ways of doing it that I think should be built into people's Christian life experience long before anything hard gets processed. And the first process is the 3, because it's pretty straightforward. Looks a lot like counseling, and that is, if you don't know how to do this, I'll kind of stabilize you and step you through it. So let's get you to feel thankful, and while you're thankful, your job is to stay thankful and to notice what comes into your mind when I ask God to tell you what he needs to know that will make you feel peace. Right? Now what happens is something will come into your mind. So pops into your mind, level 1, here's a thought came into my mind, I pass it on to level 2, is that good, bad, or scary? Level 2 isn't too sure. If you're only looking for scary things, level 2 will go, well, it's not scary, and it'll tend to drift away. Right? PTSD brain, it's not scary, I don't know, nothing scary came up. Or something will pop up and it's like, I don't talk to people about that. Right? Like, something came into my mind, it's not what I'm going to say. Because we don't talk about this. So much of this process is coaxing someone, because I'm with you, to tell me what came into your mind and get it to process around as far as level 5 is concerned. So you actually put in words. Now what is it that went through your head? Just humor me. Yeah, something went through your head. And again, wording is difficult because stuff that goes through this thought, is it a thought? Well, technically, yes, but it's not a conscious level thought, so it popped through real fast. It was like an awareness of something. Was it words? Most of the time not. Was it a picture? Not sometimes, and sometimes not. Was it just like an impression? All of these things are happening over here, but that's not what we're used to noticing or talking about with anybody. Our people just doesn't pay any attention to this. These are not the things, we've got no experience on this spectrum right here. So we're just trying to show people how, go ahead now, notice, and I don't know how many times I said, well, just humor me, tell me what went through your head. They said, well, this thought or this picture, this whatever popped through my head, but I know it's not important. Okay, who is it that determines whether it's important or not? Raise your hand over here, all right? Okay, you would determine if it's important or not. No one over here knows. You're just deciding if does it come in with a huge load of feelings? Well, God's peaceful thought rarely does, right? Not a peaceful thought if it comes in like loaded for bear. So we don't know if it's important. It didn't come in with any kind of emotional load. And you get over to you, unless you actually say it and process it and work it through out loud, there's nothing in your history that says this was an important thing to have said or done before. We look back on our life, now we got nothing under this that sounds important to us. It isn't until you actually process that relationally with another brain that will amplify for you what seemed important to me when I heard what was important, what went through your head. So again, one example, I was talking with a man about this. He came in because he was depressed. I said, so it took us 2 sessions to finally coax him to say what popped through his head. So, well, every time you've asked me that, and by now we're talking about 15 times or something like that, what always pops into my head is a picture of my dad, but I don't know why, because he died when I was a kid. And as he began talking about his dad who died as a kid, tears are rolling down his face. But he doesn't notice, because it's not anything that he notices or pays attention to. So I said, okay, you're talking about your dad and how he died as a kid and all of this. Does it make you feel anything? He says, no. I said, well, why don't you reach up and touch your face? Oh, he said, it's all wet. I said, well, what do you think that might be? But the verbal logical explainers engaging in this, I've seen wet faces before. I mean, it's that abstract, right? It's that disconnected. The attachment signal has long since been lost between the bottom of the brain and the top of the brain. There's no attachment signal that says I'm in attachment pain here. As far as I know, I'm feeling nothing. It was like, oh, I think I'm crying. Well, I said, do you have any idea why someone might cry? Oh, he said, well, maybe sad. Like puzzled, right? You're figuring this out real time, right? So this is very interesting to me. I said, that every time this has popped into your head, you thought about your dad who died when you were young, and so you don't have any feelings about him. But it's what seems to God puts in your mind every time. And when you feel your face, it's wet, and that could mean you're sad. Do you think this might have anything to do with why you're depressed? And of course you can figure out that the rest of that picture started coming together pretty fast from that point on out, right? But had there been no one to keep processing it through and reflect it from the outside and amplify it seemed important to me that his face was so soaked wet. But he didn't think it was important. It seemed to me as soon as he said my dad, and he died when I was little, my mind kind of went, blink. I think we're onto something here, right? You would not think anybody'd have that low an insight, would you? Right. Except that nothing about that dad's death ever got past level 3. There's nothing to process in this whole brain or experience. No one ever talked about it. My people never talked about it. He died when you were little. Why would you have any feelings? What difference would it make? This is obviously unimportant to you because you didn't really know him, did you? So you couldn't possibly matter, right? That's how my people think about it. That was very convincing. Not a person I knew thought this would ever matter to me, and so, and this is a story you could tell 1,000 times, 1,000 different ways. So this process is actually one where I just continue to help walk somebody through it until they have enough experience that they can begin to notice what's happening at each stage, and I actually notice where it gets stuck. So I notice no words are coming out this end. Here's an interesting thing. Whatever thought God wants you to know will show up in your mind, and you'll be aware of it within 5 to 6 seconds. It'll take you 5 to 6 seconds to be aware of how to put that in words. So we're now about 12 seconds in. So when I ask people, what does God want you to know? I mentally start either watching a clock or counting to 15. And by 15, they're either going to tell me or I'm going to have to ask. But either way, it's there. And so, interesting one, just because all of you therapists know about resistance and all that sort of stuff, right? So, one person says, what comes into my mind is just blank. So, where do we go? I said, well, let's ask God what he wants you to know about blank. And as soon as we asked what God wants you to know, because blank came consistently, 5 times, it took me 5 times to figure it out, and I realized they are perceiving blankness right now. Let me ask what God wants you to know about blankness. 2 or 3 times after that, we know what's causing the blankness. Why do you blank every time you hit this? And we're moving on. So whatever comes into your mind, that's what you need to notice, process on through. Blankness we can talk about. It's not unusual. I've been blank before. Have you been blank before? Does that mean there's nothing in there, or does it just mean now we're blank? We ought to know why we're blank. Let's talk about blankness. That's part of what my people can talk about. We can share a blank experience. I know how to be blank as good as you do. Right? And again, we're just looking at opening this door to people. The second way of doing it, and I'm thinking I can finish this by our break in 10 minutes. Second way of doing this is the group way of doing it, and that is you ask an entire group of people at the same time to remember something they appreciate, especially if it's a time when you were aware of God's presence. So you open the door to both kinds of experiences. Either, if you're not aware of God's presence at all, that's fine, just think of that iced coffee you got, and that should do it. Or if not, a time that you actually were aware of God's presence, and then ask Him what He wants you to know that will bring you peace. Now, I open the door that way. I never tell people to think about a trauma. Because sometimes Jesus wants to have you think about how much I love you, and that will bring you peace. And sometimes He wants to remind you of a time when you didn't have peace and what will bring you peace. I don't know. So one of the questions people asked is, what order do you do things? Do you do deliverance? Do you do healing? What do you do first? Do you build joy first? And the answer is, I have seen God take every possible order that I can think of, and I never know which ones He's going to do next. So my thing is, you always go find out what He wants to do next. And the reason for that is probably the second most controversial thing about the life model. The first most controversial thing is that God's an active presence. People will argue about God's active presence more than anything else. The second thing is what we call life according to the flesh or the sarx. And if you read that part of the book, the contention is that it is impossible for the human brain to know the right thing to do. That the knowledge of good and evil, which we received at the tree, is actually a hallucination. We always think we know the right thing to do. We never know the right thing to do. Now, because all of us are sure we know the right thing to do, the first thing that everybody's mind does is, but I know the right thing to do. And I'm going to try in 3 minutes to prove to you that you don't. First is statistical. If there is a moral system where there are 50 things that are simultaneously true, the number of possibilities that generates is close to the number of molecules in the known universe. So the biblical law has 600 and some things that are simultaneously true, just going through the laws of the Old Testament. So now you have to have a system in which 600 things that are simultaneously known to be true have to be analyzed and told what God wants to do based on those 600 things, and update that at least conscious rate of 5 times per second. Now we know that if there are only 50, you would need as many molecules as in the known universe with instantaneous communication between all of them to calculate exactly what God is doing right now, because I know all of His laws, and based on that, I can tell you exactly what God is going to do right now and how He's thinking about this. And furthermore, if you go to Revelation, remember when the great scroll is opened at the end of time, and they say, who's worthy to open the scroll? What's in that scroll is every bad thing that's ever happened in human history. And so the answer that you calculate has to be the same thing that will, at the end of time, bring together all elements of human history. So for everybody on earth, this will work together for their good. Everyone who's ever existed, and everyone who will exist, and everyone who exists now. The right thing to do is the answer that will produce that outcome in the end. Now, if you think you can calculate that and keep up at the 6 or 5 times per second, I'll let you slow it down to 5 times per second. You're up to doing that. Then you can tell me exactly what God wants to do next. And that's the right thing to do. Anything else has greatly oversimplified the matter at hand. So we find Jesus not trying to do that calculation. He said, I only do what I see my Father doing. So I'm not even trying to run the math in my human brain. And at the end of time, He's the one who's worthy to open the scroll. And that's because He always tapped into the big computer, even when He was down here running the limited unit. Right? So if you think you can do better than that, then I'm willing to let you tell me the right thing to do. But if we look at every time human beings calculated the right thing to do, like as soon as they got the knowledge of good and evil, and God came to the garden looking for them, the right thing to do was fig leaves and hide in the bush. Right answer? Okay, throughout the Old Testament, whenever people did what was right in their own eyes, did they get the right answer? When the leading scholars of what God is doing, who understood all of the law, the scribes and the Pharisees, dealt with Jesus, did they get the right answer? They had the entire Old Testament memorized. Do any of you? So they could pull it all up from memory, which we can't. Now, can you beat that? Because they always got consistently the wrong answer. Right? So I'm going back to say, no human being can figure out the right thing to do. Can you follow what God wants you to do next?
Yes.
We can do that. Can we prove it's the right thing to do? No, because we can't even calculate the things, the simple things I told you that have to go into the answer, right? So we can't prove it's the right thing to do, but we can know it's in keeping with his character because we can learn enough about him that it comes to our mind, oh yeah, God said he was this, God said that. All of these things will be consistent. We just didn't know that's how he wanted. Did he want justice or did he want mercy today? I don't know, but this is consistent with his justice, is consistent with his mercy, is consistent with his love. We see the consistencies, but so slow that we're way behind real time, right? Haven't you found things in your life that God was doing and it was 20 years later before you figured out what he was up to?
Yeah.
And then you probably only got part of it, right? So we were really slow at this particular process, and we don't have to. So that's the second thing about the life model. We want to just invite God to say, what do you want me to know? I don't want to tell you. I don't want to preload in your head what it is you have to make God answer. Because that might not be the next step for you. And so one of the fun things that just I'll again, from my personal experience here, as I'm learning to bring Jesus into this, I remember dealing with somebody who was, they'd had a lot of abuse in the religious arena, right? So they had a lot of what we call spiritual or religious trauma in their life. And they had a huge set of bad feelings about God. So I said, well, let's invite Jesus to be here. And they're like, no way I'm going to do that. So I said, well, okay, I screwed up. I clearly have gotten level 2 in a buzz about this one, right? Now, Jesus wouldn't have done that, so I wasn't doing what he wanted me to do, and I wasn't listening, which is not uncommon. So I went back to him and said, okay, I screwed it up. What do you want me to do? So I asked them then, would they like to have a different sort of experience with God? That's what came to my mind. I didn't know. It's like, well, yeah, they would like that. I mean, I said, okay, well, are you aware of anything God wants you to know? And they said, well, it's like I'm sitting on Earth and Jesus is sitting on Mars, and he's given me a telescope and I'm watching him. I said, oh, very good. Okay, now, Lord, so how do you want to, and I tried to make something happen. It's like, no, he's on Mars. I mean, this doesn't feel like I'm getting any progress. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 5 weeks, 2 months later, he's on Mars. And they're looking at him through the telescope. What is he doing? Absolutely nothing. I'm going, no, God doesn't do absolutely nothing. What do you mean he's doing absolutely nothing? Well, actually, to make this run a little faster, get to the analysis long before I did, what was ended up happening is that level 2 is having an ongoing experience of Jesus with absolutely nothing fearful or bad. But they're developing a connection of good. This being is always there, constantly around, has not done anything in months that would scare me in any way. So as Jesus began to move closer to them, at no point did he ever trigger level 2. Until such a point that they were actually processing lots of things together. I thought we were wasting time and I wasn't doing my guided whatever fast, because God should be doing something. We should be getting healing, right? Something should be happening. No, we're getting bonding. We're getting attachment. And the wonderful thing is I've watched Jesus move by every single level 2, whatever the set of traps were. He's found a way to get through that doesn't set off anything at level 2 that's bad or scary. If I'm not pushing the way I think he ought to go. Otherwise, I'm constantly triggering level 2 with what I think is how you talk about Jesus or whatever else. But every time I've let him do it his way, he's found some way. I remember the most interesting one for me is someone said, well, I see a beggar. And I said, oh. Yeah, they said, did you know that beggars were sacred in Babylon? And I'm like, no, I don't know. Never heard that before. I don't even know if it's true. And likewise, I don't even particularly care. Right? But in their mind, there were sacred beggars someplace in Babylon, and this was a beggar, and this was not just any old beggar, but this was something sacred. And it was harmless, because the beggars don't hurt you. And it grew from there. And well, eventually, we never heard about another beggar or Babylon or anything else. I had another person who came in who was an ardent feminist, an atheist. And after the first encounter with God, she came back and she said, I found a picture of God. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting, because I know that can't be right. And she pulled out a picture of an Egyptian cat goddess. Right? Going like, you're right. Well, now, okay, well, what does God want us to do? I decided not to engage it. And I found out that in her childhood, she had an abusive family, and everything she had learned about nurture, she'd learned from a feral cat that lived under the deck. By the next week, God was no longer a cat goddess. But I'm here to say that even if it takes going through the image in your mind of an Egyptian cat goddess to get close, he'll do that without setting off level 2. And eventually it'll become clearer to us who he really is. And if you actually want me to be honest about it, my image of who God is has gone through some pretty dramatic changes across my lifespan, even though I would call them all biblical, right? So it shouldn't be too surprising that God's clearing up the picture of who he really is in all of our minds. And whatever path he takes, as he's moving towards that, we ought to let him do it. And so this is what we're trying to do then as a group. We want to bring people in God's presence, say, what do you want them to know that will bring them peace? And then tell somebody what it is that brought you peace. Share the peace story with other people. And it doesn't matter how big the group is. Last comment about that with Uganda. Sent a team of 2 people to Uganda. We said, bring together 50 leaders, and during the day, teach them how to do this. And then at night, send them out in groups of 2 and let them deal with 50 or 100 people in Uganda. Teach them what they learned during the day. By the end of 2 or 3 days in Uganda, we had 50 people who knew how to run this Emanuel process in groups, and we had reached somewhere over 3,000 people, almost all of whom, matter of fact, the reports are so remarkable, I still say almost all. We have no known cases of people that weren't healed of major traumas within that context, which has not got anything to do with how good the technique is. It has to do with how active God is if you give him a chance to do it. And now we left behind, essentially 50 people who know how to do this after 3 days. That, the people who experienced it are all telling others what happened when they experienced God's presence. So the third way we're going to look at after a break, I ran out of time without getting to our third way, but after the break we'll do that, and then I'll also try to tell you about Sri Lanka. So.